The aliens sent a distress call then. Humanity's death world or fleet arrived. The signal came in broken, like a voice, calling through a collapsing tunnel. 3 days ago, I would have told you. The Kaith never spoke to anyone. 200 years of absolute silence, no trade, no diplomacy, no answers to any hail from any species across any frequency. They had simply drawn a line around their territory and dared the galaxy to cross it. Nobody crossed it, not the Vorkai. With their 12-planet empire, not the Shaleth Combine with their fleet of 700 warships, nobody. Then the Kaith screamed. I was at my desk on observation post Lyra 7 when the signal arrived. My name is Kale Morrow. I am by profession a diplomat, not a soldier, not a hero. I arrange meetings, I write reports, and I translate the awkward silences between species into something people can work with. I have spent 11 years getting very good at being overlooked because overlooked people hear things that matter. Petty Officer Gwen Holloway was the first to catch the signal. She sat 3 stations to my left, headphones around her neck, and she went completely still. That kind of stillness is never a good sign. It is the stillness of someone hearing something their brain does not want to be true. She looked at me. I crossed the room in 4 steps. The signal was 17 seconds long. It had been transmitted on a frequency so old that most modern receivers were not even tuned to it, which told me 2 things immediately. First, the Kaith had been sitting behind their wall for so long that their communication technology had not moved in generations. Second, whatever was happening to them was bad enough that they did not have time to update. Translation came through rough and incomplete, the way translations always do when a species has never spoken to you before and you are working from fragments of their language that your databases collected from ancient broadcasts decades ago. But rough and incomplete was enough. They are eating our star. We cannot stop them. Anyone, please. That was all. I sat with those 5 sentences for a long time. The observation post was quiet around me. Lieutenant Commander Peter Ash, the ranking officer on duty, had already forwarded the signal up the chain to the Consortium Joint Council. Ash was a careful man. He believed in process. He believed that the right response to a crisis was a well-organized meeting, followed by a thorough report, followed by a vote. In his defense, that system had worked reasonably well for 60 years. But 60 years of consortium diplomacy had also produced exactly one response to an active threat of stellar consumption. And that response was a subcommittee. I did not tell Ash what I was doing when I opened a secondary channel and encoded a tight beam transmission toward Earth. I did not explain myself to anyone. I simply attached the Kaith distress signal, added 4 words of my own, and sent it. The 4 words were, "They ask for anyone." Then I closed the channel, went back to my desk and waited. The Joint Council convened within 6 hours. I sat in the back of the observation chamber and watched 14 alien representatives argue about jurisdiction, precedent, risk assessment, and the political implications of responding to a species that had never acknowledged the consortium's existence. The Shaleth delegate made a lengthy point about the dangers of intervening in a conflict whose parameters were not yet understood. The Vorkai representative expressed concern about provocative action. An elder Thalan ambassador, whose species had been part of the Consortium for 300 years suggested that perhaps a formal inquiry should be submitted to the Caith before any response was considered. The Caith were watching their son being drained, but yes, a formal inquiry sounded lovely. I did not say that out loud, I wrote it in my personal slog, which is where I kept all the things I could not say out loud. The vote, when it finally came, was to observe and wait. 14 species in the room, 14 votes to do nothing. I did not vote. Diplomats do not vote. We facilitate. I walked back to my quarters and sat on the edge of my bunk and thought about the signal. They are eating our star. We cannot stop them. Anyone, please, anyone, not a consortium member, not an ally, not a friend. The Caith had never had any of those things. They sent that signal into the open dark and used the one word that has no prerequisites, no political requirements, no species attached to it. Anyone, meaning whoever is out there, meaning whoever hears this, meaning if you have anything at all, please come. On the third day, the long-range sensors went loud. I was eating breakfast when Gwen Holloway's voice came over the internal comm, and even through the static I could hear that her stillness had come back, not the stillness of bad news this time, something else, something that I would later learn to recognize as the specific wide-eyed quiet of a person watching something arrive that they had genuinely never expected to see. Ambassador Marrow, she said, you might want to come look at this. I put down my coffee and went. The sensor display covered an entire wall of the monitoring room. The Voranti corridor stretched across it like a river of dark space between two territories, and moving through that corridor, dropping out of faster than light transit in sequence, like a string of lights coming on one by one, were ships, not one ship, not a scouting pair of ships. I counted 47 before I stopped counting, because by then the other officers in the room were counting too, and the number was still going up. Heavy cruisers, carrier class vessels with launch bays along their flanks, destroyer escorts moving in tight formation, specialized craft that I did not immediately recognize, but that made the Vorkai technical officer beside me go very quiet. Every ship was marked with Earth's designation codes. Every ship had been used. I could see it in the hull patching, in the asymmetric plating, where repairs had been made under field conditions, in the way the formation moved, not in the clean geometric patterns that Academy fleets practice on training runs, but in the loose, adaptive spacing of crews that have maneuvered around wreckage before and know to leave room for the unexpected. These ships had seen things, they had survived those things, and now they were here. Peter Ash appeared at my shoulder. He stared at the display for a long moment. Did you know about this? He asked. I forwarded the signal to Earth Fleet Command, I said. I mentioned that the Caith had asked for anyone. He turned to look at me. His expression was not angry exactly. It was the expression of a man who has just realized that the universe has moved considerably faster than his planning documents anticipated. The council voted to observe and wait. He said, yes, I said, Earth is observing and then not waiting. The comm system opened before he could respond. The voice that came through was calm, unhurried, and carried the specific kind of authority that does not need to announce itself. Observation. Post Lyra 7, this is Fleet Admiral Yuna Ashiro aboard the Earth Federation naval ship Hadal Zone We have received and logged the Kaith distress transmission. We are en route to the Kaith home system. I need coordinates and any capability. Data you have on the hostile force. Please transmit immediately. She did. Not ask if it was all right. She did not request permission. She stated what she needed and expected it to be provided. 14 alien representatives in that council room had just voted to do nothing. One human admiral, 11 light years away, had already done the math and started moving. I reached past Ash and opened the response channel myself. Admiral Ashiro, I said, this is Ambassador Kale Morrow, transmitting everything we have now. I should warn you, it is not much. It never is, she said. Thank you, Ambassador. Ashiro out. Channel closed. The display showed the fleet still forming up, still moving, still arriving through the corridor in that steady, relentless sequence. 47 ships, then 51, then 54. Around me, the alien officers who had spent 3 days discussing processes and precedents stood and watched in silence. I heard the Thalan ambassador say something quietly in her own language. I knew enough Thalan to understand it. She said, what manner of creature moves like that? I thought about it for a moment. I thought about a planet that had spent 4 billion years making things tough enough to survive it. I thought about a species that had climbed out of ice ages and plagues and every catastrophe a hostile world could produce, not by becoming invincible, but by becoming relentless. I thought about the word anyone hanging in the dark and the fact that on Earth anyone had always meant us. I turned back to my station and started pulling together everything we had on the Vorathin. Whatever it was not going to be enough. It never was, but it was a start. I had never been aboard a warship before. 11 years as a diplomat, and the closest I'd come to military hardware was watching consortium peacekeeping vessels dock at civilian stations. They were clean ships, well organized, everything in its designated place, every procedure followed in sequence, every surface maintained to a standard that spoke of order above all else. The Hadal zone was different. It was not dirty, it was not chaotic, but it was alive in a way that consortium vessels were not, in the way that a living organism is alive compared to a diagram of one. The corridors hummed with activity that never fully stopped. Crew members moved with the unhurried speed of people who had learned to be fast without looking rushed. Every surface showed the history of the ship, a weld seam here, a replaced panel there, a section of corridor where the floor plating was a slightly different shade because the original had been torn out and replaced in a repair bay somewhere between one engagement and the next. Admiral Yuna Ashiro had invited me aboard 20 minutes after my transmission. She had not explained why when I asked her aide. Lieutenant Commander Dale Price, he said, simply that the Admiral liked to have a diplomat within arm's reach when things became complicated, and that things were about to become considerably complicated. He was not wrong. The briefing room was midship, surrounded by displays that pulled live data from every sensor package the Huddle zone carried. 8 senior officers sat around the central table. I took the seat offered to me at the far end and tried to take up as little space as possible, which is a skill that every good diplomat develops early. Ashiro came in last. She was shorter than I expected. In my experience, military commanders of great reputation tend to arrive with their reputation preceding them invisible ways, the deliberate walk, the set of the jaw, the practiced look that says, I have made decisions that altered history, and I am comfortable with that. Ashiro walked like someone who had a long list of things to do and intended to get through all of them before dinner. She sat down, opened a display, and started talking. What we know, she said, the Vorathin are non-biological, no confirmed origin system. They were first observed 40 years ago in a dead system. In the outer reach, a star that had been partially drained, its core exposed, its remaining mass coalescing into something that the survey team's report described as a wound. Nobody made the connection. At the time, 3 more dead systems were logged over the following decade. 19 years ago, Shalith mining convoy documented live harvesting activity for the first time and transmitted footage before their ship was destroyed. She pulled up the footage on the central display. I had read descriptions of it in my briefing files. Reading descriptions was nothing like watching it. The Vorathin harvester was the size of a small moon. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it had a terrible geometric logic to it, a structure built purely for function, every element of it dedicated to the single purpose of extracting matter from a star and converting that matter into energy. Long filaments extended from its core and reached into the outer layers of the star, pulling plasma upward, arcs that moved like slow rivers of fire. The star itself was visibly smaller than its recorded pre-contact size. They were eating it methodically, efficiently, without any apparent awareness that the solar system around them contained inhabited planets, or possibly without caring. 3 harvesters are currently active in the Kaith home system, Ashiro said, based on the rate of consumption visible in the Kaith's own sensor data, which they began transmitting to us the moment we entered range. The star has lost approximately 4% of its outer mass in the 7 days since initial contact. At current rate, the inner planets will experience gravitational instability. Within 14 months, Kaitharan Prime, the inhabited world, will be outside the habitable zone within 3 years. Lieutenant Commander Dale Price, who handled tactical analysis, brought up the strike models on a secondary display. The harvesters do not appear to have traditional weapon systems, he said. What they have is worse. The plasma conduits they use for extraction can be redirected. It takes them approximately 90 seconds to realign a conduit from stellar extraction to directed energy. We are not sure of the maximum range, but the Shalith footage suggests it is significant. How significant? I asked. Every head in the room turned toward me. I was the only non-military person present. I was aware that I had just spoken without being invited to, which was not standard protocol in a military briefing, but Ashiro did not seem bothered by it. Significant enough that a direct approach against an active harvester would put our ships inside effective range before we could generate sufficient damage to force a shutdown, she said, which is why we are not approaching directly. She nodded to Price, and the tactical display shifted to show the 3 harvesters in relation to Kaitharan's sun, the planet, and the approach vectors the human fleet had already plotted. The plasma conduits are the key, Price said. Each harvester has 4 primary conduits. The conduits are large because they have to B. They are moving stellar matter. Large means they have significant structural surface area. Surface area means vulnerabilities. The plan is not to destroy the harvesters. The plan is to sever the conduit which forces each harvester to retract its filaments, which in turn exposes the drive core on the underside of the structure. He paused. The drive core is the part we can actually damage. It was elegant, the way that a very sharp knife is elegant. It did not require overwhelming force. It required precision, speed, and the willingness to close distance with something the size of a small moon while it was in the process of reconfiguring its stellar scale weapons to point at you. The consortium liaison vessels hold at the engagement boundary, Ashiro said, and her voice carried nothing that sounded like criticism, just a statement of fact. We will go in without them. There will be political consequences, I said. There are always political consequences, she said. That is why I wanted a diplomat aboard. She looked at me steadily. Your job, Ambassador Morrow, is to make sure that when this is over, the consequences favor us. Can you do that? I thought about 14 alien representatives voting to observe and wait while a civilization watched its sun being consumed. Yes, I said. Good. She turned back to her officers. We move in 6 hours. Price, I want updated conduit geometry on my display within 2. Holland, coordinate with engineering on the redundancy protocols. I want every critical system backed up twice. Gen. Fleet formation review at 1400. Questions? There were no questions. The officer stood and moved, and the room became purposeful in the way that only military rooms become purposeful when the moment that all the preparation has been pointing toward finally arrives. I stayed in my seat for a moment after they had gone, looking at the display showing the Keth home system, the 3 harvesters, and the small dot that was Catherine Prime, a world of people who had spent 2 centuries alone behind wall, who had never asked anyone for anything, who had finally, in the worst moment of their history, sent one word into the dark. Anyone outside the viewports of the Hadal Zone. The human fleet was moving into formation. 54 ships, each one carrying crews who had grown up on a world that had been trying to remove them from the gene pool since before their species could stand upright, and who had responded to that fact by getting very, very good at surviving things that should not be survivable. I opened my personal log and started writing. I wrote, I do not know if this will work. I know that it is being attempted. Sometimes in the long record of what we have done and not done, that is the only distinction that matters. Then I closed the log and went to find something to eat, because in 6 hours we would be in range of 3 machines that 8 stars, and I had learned long ago that it is very hard to think clearly when you are hungry. The Keth home system looked peaceful from a distance. That was the cruelest part. Catherine's sun still burned. It still sent light across its planets in the slow, warm arc that it had maintained for billions of years. If you looked at it from far enough away, at the right angle, with the sensors tuned to the visible spectrum only, you might almost convince yourself that nothing was wrong. We were not far enough away, and we were not looking at the right angle. On the tactical display, the plasma conduits of the 3 harvesters glowed like open wounds in the star's outer atmosphere. They pulsed with each extraction cycle, rhythmic and steady, the way a pump pulses when it is working hard. Star's corona was visibly disrupted, pulled into long trailing streams that fed up into the harvester's collection chambers and disappeared. The surface of the sun shimmered in ways that a healthy star does not shimmer. I was on the bridge because Usharo had not told me to leave it, and I had decided that was as close to an invitation as I was likely to get. I stood against the rear wall, out of the way of every station, and I watched all ships confirm formation. Dale Price said, "Fleet is in position." Vorathine responds. Ashiro asked, "Nothing yet there." Aware of us, our approach woke up there. Sensor arrays about 40 minutes ago, but they haven't redirected any conduits. They don't think we're a threat. Ashiro said, "Not a question, that's the working assumption." Yes, she let that sit for a moment. I understood why. Vorathine had presumably encountered other species attempting to stop them before. Whatever those encounters had looked like, they had ended the same way. The Vorathine were still here, still harvesting, still completely functional. Whatever information they had about the capabilities of the species in this region of space told them that nothing approaching would be worth redirecting a conduit for. They had not met humans before. Fleet, this is Ashiro. We execute on my mark. Priority targets are the primary conduits on Harvesters 2 and 3. Harvester 1 is secondary. The drive core exposure on 1 will take longer due to the conduit geometry, so we hit it last. I want concentrated fire on those conduits, then immediate dispersion before their realignment window closes. Do not give them a stationary target. Move and keep moving. She paused. We are going to lose ships today, she said. That is a fact, not a prediction. I want everyone to understand that the crews of those ships will be remembered by name. Every name. Now let's go make sure the names are worth remembering. She pressed the mark. The fleet moved. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not clean. I want to be clear about that, because stories have a way of making things clean in the retelling, smoothing out the chaos and the noise into something that sounds organized in hindsight. The battle for the Keth system was not organized. It was a controlled collision between human intent and an enemy that had never been told it could lose. The first volley from the fleet hit Harvester 2's primary conduits with enough concentrated energy to sever 2 of them simultaneously. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The plasma that had been moving through those conduits had nowhere to go, and when plasma at stellar temperatures loses its directed channel, it does what plasma does, which is expand outward in every direction. The Harvester's outer shell lit up as its own extracted material washed back across it. Then the Vorathine realigned. The redirected conduit came around in 91 seconds, 2 seconds longer than the analysts had estimated, which gave the ships in the nearest attack formation just enough time to begin their dispersion. Just enough. 3 corvettes at the edge of the formation were still within range when the beam swept through. I watched 3 ship indicators on the tactical display go from green to red. Gone. 3 ships. Just like that. The beam had not held on them long enough for them to see it coming. I held onto the rail behind me and did not look away from the display, because looking away felt wrong, even though looking at it was hard. The fleet did not stop. The dispersal had already happened the moment the conduit began to redirect. Every ship in the fleet had changed vector because that was what the plan called for, and the plan had been built by people who assumed the enemy would fight back. Dispersal meant there was no concentrated group to sweep. The beam moved through empty space where ships had been half a minute before Harvester 3's conduits came apart under a second concentrated strike. Then Ashiro's voice cut through the comm channel, clean and steady as a compass reading. Harvester 2 drive core is exposed. All designated strike groups rotate to attack Vector 4. You have the window. The drive core of Harvester 2 took 11 seconds of concentrated fire from 9 ships before it failed. The failure was not an explosion in the way that I expected. It was an implosion. The massive internal energies of the Harvester collapsing inward as the containment gave way, the outer shell folding around the sudden absence at its center, the whole enormous structure becoming very rapidly much smaller. Then the outer shell gave way and it stopped being smaller and became nothing at all, in a bloom of energy that lit up the tactical display so bright that the sensors had to adjust. Harvester 1 was the problem. The analysts had been right about the drive core geometry. Conduit arrangement on Harvester 1 meant that severing the conduits would take longer, and that the window between conduit severance and core exposure would be narrower. What the analysts had not fully modeled was that Harvester 1, having watched Harvester 2 cease to exist, would immediately begin an emergency retraction of its own conduits. It was adapting. I heard Ashiro say a single word very quietly under her breath. Then she said louder, "It's pulling back. If it gets those conduits fully retracted, we lose the exposure window entirely." Price options. We go in closer, Price said. Inside redirected conduit range. Yes. There was a pause that lasted approximately 1 second. In that 1 second, I thought about the 3 red indicators on the tactical display. I thought about the names that would be read later. I thought about the Keth elder on the planet below who had not yet been told that anyone had answered. Volunteers only, Ashiro said. I need 6 ships willing to push inside to the safety margin and hold fire on the remaining conduits long enough for the rest of the fleet to get the angle on the drive core. 6 ships. Anyone not willing to go peel off now. No consequences. No record. The comm channel opened and 6 captains reported in one after another without hesitation. All 6 accepted what those 6 ships did in the next 4 minutes would be discussed in military academies for a generation. They pushed inside the rain margin where the Voratines redirected conduits could track them, and they kept moving, constantly changing vector, never presenting a stationary target, forcing the Harvester to continually recalculate its aim while the rest of the fleet circled for the angle. 2 of the 6 took damage, 1 badly enough that the crew began evacuating 2 emergency pods, but none of them stopped moving. None of them left the engagement zone. None of them gave the Harvester moment of stillness to lock onto the drive core exposed for 11 seconds. That was enough. The second Harvester ceased to exist in the same implosion bloom as the first. On the tactical display, Harvester 3, the one whose conduits we had severed in the opening strike, was already drifting, its systems failing without the power generation of its extraction cycle. It would not be harvesting anything again. The battle was over. I became aware in the ringing Quiet that followed that I had been. Holding my breath for some time, I let it out slowly. Around me the bridge crew was very still for a moment, then someone quietly started doing the work. That comes after damage reports, casualties assessment, status checks, all the necessary business of accounting. For what had just happened, 3 ships lost. Price said, the Callaway, the Bright Meridian, and the Heart. Full crew loss on the Callaway and Bright Meridian. 17 survivors from the Heart, currently in emergency pods, retrieval underway. I wrote the names in my log, the Callaway, the Bright Meridian, the Heart, 3 ships, 341 people, as I would later learn, not a number, 341 individuals who had come out here because anyone meant them. Ashiro stood at the forward viewport for a long moment, looking at the Keth system sun burning steadily. Now its conduit wounds already beginning to close as the extracted plasma dissipated. Then she turned. Open a channel to the planet, she said. Standard greeting frequencies. Let's see if anybody's home. The channel opened. For a moment there was nothing. Then, in a voice that carried every quality of a people who had not spoken to anyone outside their own world in 2 centuries, cautious, exhausted, and very carefully hopeful, something answered. The translation was rough. It always was the first time, but it was enough. The Consortium Joint Council convened in emergency session 12 hours after the battle. I sat in the front row for the first time in my career, which was not a position I had ever particularly wanted. The room was louder than usual. Every delegate had opinions. Most of those opinions were about humanity, and a significant number of them were about me personally, which is what happens when you forward a distress signal to Earth Fleet Command without informing 14 alien governments. First, the Shayla delegate made the longest speech. It covered in rough order the violation of consortium protocols, the risk of provoking the Vorathin into a larger offensive, the precedent set by unilateral military action, the question of what authority Earth had to act in a system that belonged to a non-consortium species, and the general concern that humanity's presence in the battle theater might have caused as many problems as it solved. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was not wrong about any of it. He was also looking at 3 dead harvesters and an inhabited planet that still had a functioning sun. I let him finish. I let 3 other delegates have their say as well. Then I stood up. The Keth asked for anyone. I said. The consortium voted to observe and wait. Earth answered. I understand that the process by which Earth answered was not correct under our existing protocols. I am prepared to discuss revisions to those protocols at whatever length the Council requires. I looked around the room. I would also like to note that the planet below us is still inhabited and the star above it is still burning, but if we are going to have a long conversation about process, it might be worth doing so in the full knowledge that the process this time did not save anyone. The humans who went in without permission saved someone. I think that distinction matters. The room went quiet, not the quiet of agreement, the quiet of people absorbing something uncomfortable. Then they Thalanth ambassador, the eldest voice. The council spoke. Humans have a reputation and in records, she said. Slowly, we have always categorized your species as a death world anomaly, something that survived conditions that should not produce civilization. And that carries the marks of that. Survival in ways that make other species uncomfortable. We have discussed it. Clinically as a curiosity, a biological footnote. She paused. I have spent the last 18 hours watching the footage of your fleet's engagement. I have watched your ships take fire and keep moving. I have watched 6 of your captains go inside a range where survival was not the most likely outcome. None of them left. I have watched Admiral Isharo stand at a viewport this morning and read 341 names aloud, one by one. Without stopping, she looked at me directly. We have been wrong about what you are, she said. I do not mean that as criticism. I mean it as the most honest thing I have said in 30 years of counsel service. I did not know what to say to that, so I said thank you. Diplomatically, that was probably not the ideal response, but it was the true one. What I did not say in the council chamber, I wrote in my log. That night I wrote they called us a death world anomaly. They meant it as a polite way of saying we had no business being here, that a species from a planet like Earth, with Earth's gravity and radiation and pathogen load and geological instability, should by all rights have stopped somewhere around the tribal stage and stayed there. The consortium species grew up on calm worlds, mostly stable climates, manageable predators, predictable seasons. They developed their civilizations in conditions that rewarded patience and careful planning. Because patience and careful planning worked, Earth rewarded speed and adaptation and the specific refusal to accept that a bad situation was a permanent one. Different environments, different lessons, neither wrong, but ours included a few that the galaxy had not encountered in quite this form before. On the planet below, the Keth were doing something they had not done in 2 centuries. They were opening their communications array, not just on the frequency they used for the distress signal, all frequencies. The wall they had built around themselves, the silence they had maintained against every approach from every species for 200 years was coming down, not all at once, slowly, carefully, like something that has been held shut for so long that the person opening it is not entirely sure it can be opened without breaking. But it was opening. Gwen Holloway, who had been attached to my staff for the duration, brought me the first translation of the Keth surface broadcasts late in the evening. It's mostly internal, she said. Government communication, emergency services, coordination, population status reports. But there's one that's on a broad external frequency. She handed me the translation sheet. The Keth broadcast was not addressed to anyone specific. It was on an open frequency that anyone in range could receive. It was very short. It said, to the ones who came, we did not know you existed. We did not know anyone would come. We have no language yet for what you are to us, but our sun is still burning. We will find the words. I read it twice, then I put it face down on my desk and sat for a while. In the quiet, 341 names, the Callaway, the Bright Meridian, the Heart people who had gotten into ships and come out here because a species they had never met used a word that had no prerequisites. Anyone, and humans being what they are, had decided that meant them. I thought about what the Thalandan ambassador had said. We have been wrong about what you are. Maybe, but I also thought that we were not entirely what she now thought we were either, because the story that had just happened was neater than the truth. The truth was that we had political reasons to respond as well as moral ones. The truth was that the people who planned that battle were also calculating the consortium's future relationship with the Kaith and what access to Kaith territory might mean. Strategically, the truth was that Admiral Oshiro had told me, privately, and without ceremony, that she had recommended the response partly because she believed the Veridian were going to push further into inhabited space, regardless, and that it was better to engage them on someone else's ground than to wait until they reached ours. None of that made the 341 less real. None of that made the Keth sun less burning. Good things happen for complicated reasons, and complicated reasons do not make the good things less good. That was something I had learned in 11 years of diplomacy and was still learning every day. The next morning I began drafting the consortium's formal response to the Keth. It was the most important document I had ever written, and I rewrote it 6 times over 3 days, which is 3 more rewrites than I have ever given anything. I did not show it to the council before I sent it. I sent it, and then I told the council what I had sent, which is a diplomatic maneuver that works exactly once in a career and should be deployed only when you are very sure. I was very sure. The Keth's question came in on the 4th day. It came in on the same broad external frequency as their first message, which told me they intended it to be heard by everyone. It was addressed very simply to the human fleet. It said, "What manner of creature fights for strangers it has never met?" I had been expecting the question. I had been turning the answer over in my mind for 4 days, trying different versions of it, testing the language, checking the translation matrices to make sure the concepts would carry. Diplomatic answers are built to be precise. Every word is considered. Every implication is mapped. I wrote 4 sentences. I sent them. Then I sat back and thought about the sun burning over a planet full of people who had just learned that the universe contains something they had not previously known existed, and I thought that whatever happened next, they would not be learning it alone. Outside the viewport, the fleet was beginning its resupply cycle. The damaged ships were being assessed. The names of the dead were being recorded, and somewhere in the outer dark beyond the range of our sensors, the Vorathine were moving. Retreating for now, but moving because things like the Vorathine did not retreat permanently. They regrouped. They adapted slowly in the way that machines adapt, building new models from new data. The consortium's rapid response subcommittee was already meeting to discuss protocol revisions. It would take them months, but it would happen, which was 1 month shorter than it would have taken without the last week's events. That was how chain worked in bodies like the consortium. You did not break through, you wore through. You kept showing up and making the argument and demonstrating the case until the argument won. Earth was good at wearing through things. 4 billion years of practice. I closed my log for the night and went to bed, and for the first time in 11 years, I fell asleep without reviewing my notes for the next day's meetings. There was something on the other side of the night that needed doing, but that was tomorrow. Tonight I let myself simply breathe. 1 year is not very long in the history of anything that matters. I had been a diplomat long enough to know that the events which feel pivotal in the moment often take decades to fully unfold, and that the Events which feel like small administrative footnotes sometimes turn out to have rearranged everything. So, when I say that in 1 year, the Keth broke their 2-century isolation and formally petitioned for consortium membership, and the consortium restructured its rapid response doctrine in ways that would have been politically impossible 18 months earlier, and the Vorathine were confirmed to be massing in the outer dark at coordinates that human fleet analysts had been pointing to for 9 months. I want to be clear that I am not suggesting any of this was simple. None of it was simple. All of it was earned. My name is still Kale Morrow. I am still a diplomat. I am now Earth's senior galactic ambassador, which is a title that sounds more precious than it feels when you are in a formal hearing before the Consortium Grand Council trying to explain in clear and non-antagonistic terms why human fleet responded to distress call without authorization and started a war with a stellar harvesting civilization. It is less of a war than that sounds. Vorathine do not negotiate, which means they have not declared anything. They have simply retreated to a distance at which they are regrouping. And the human analysts who have been studying their movement patterns for 9 months believe they understand what the next approach will look like and from which direction it will come. This is the kind of information that a year ago the consortium would have received and formed a subcommittee to assess. Today, it went directly to the Joint Defense Planning Group that now includes human tactical advisors as permanent members. Small changes, enormous differences. The Grand Council hearing had been scheduled for 3 hours. It ran for 7. I sat through all 7, which is the part of diplomacy that nobody writes stories about. The sitting, the listening, the quiet maintenance of a calm expression, while 17 delegates express at considerable length every shade of opinion about a decision you made a year ago. By hour 5 I was counting ceiling tiles. There are 212 ceiling tiles in the Consortium Grand Chamber. I have now counted them 4 times from different angles and always arrive at the same number, which is more than I can say for the votes. Admiral Ashira was not present. She was in the Voranti corridor with 30 ships watching the outer dark, because watching the outer dark was more useful than sitting in a room where everyone already knew what had happened and was discussing it. Anyway, that was Ashiro's view of most councils, and I found it difficult to argue with, even when I was professionally obligated to argue with it. When the delegates had finished, I stood and gave the speech I had prepared. It was a good speech. It covered the gaps in existing rapid response protocol, acknowledged the legitimate concerns about unilateral action, proposed a framework for an expedited authorization system could function in timelines measured in days rather than months, and concluded with a careful statement about the importance of shared values and shared defense. Then something happened that I had not planned for. The door at the rear of the Grand Chamber opened, and Veth Arasamis walked in. I had not met Veth Arasamis before today. I knew the name because everyone knew the name, the Keth Elder, who had composed the first open broadcast, who had written the question that had traveled across the consortium and been translated into 47 languages and discussed in academic papers and news broadcasts and late-night conversations between people who were trying to figure out what to make of what had happened in the Keth system. But I had not seen her in person, partly because the Keth were still in the early stages of their reintegration, and receiving visitors required careful protocol management, and partly because Veth Arisamas had, by all accounts, very firm opinions about her own schedule. She was old. Not old in the way that humans age, but old in the way that something becomes old when it has been carrying weight for a very long time. She moved carefully and without hurry, and the chamber went silent as she made her way to the speaker's position. Nobody had invited her to speak. She had simply arrived and gone to the speaker's position, and the entire consortium, Grand Council, had collectively decided that this was acceptable because they're beings whose authority is not granted by committees. She stood for a moment. Without speaking, she looked around the chamber, then she looked at me. I was asked, she said through the translation matrix. The voice was slow and precise, each word given its full weight, to convey the position of the Keth Provisional Council on the events of 1 year ago and their ongoing implications. I will do that, but first I want to read something. She produced a document, not a data pad, an actual printed document, which told me it was something she intended to keep, something physical, something she could hold. 1 year ago, she said, we sent a transmission into the open dark. We were not certain anyone would hear it. We were not certain that hearing it would matter, because we had spent 2 centuries learning that the universe beyond our wall was indifferent to us. We thought perhaps it was indifferent to everyone. We thought that was simply what the universe was. She paused. We received many responses to our distress call. The Consortium Joint Council sent a formal acknowledgement within 6 hours, which informed us that our situation was being assessed and that a response protocol was being developed. We were grateful for the acknowledgement. We understood that large bodies move slowly. We had moved slowly ourselves for a long time. There was something in her voice that was not quite humor, something drier than that and older. Then we received a different kind of response. 54 ships, no authorization, no precedent, no request for permission or political assurance or formal recognition of mutual interest. Just a fleet moving through our corridor, and a voice asking for our coordinates so they could figure out where to go. She looked down at the document in her hands. I have here a document that I received 4 days after the battle. It is a reply to a question that I transmitted on a broad open frequency. I transmitted the question publicly because I felt that the answer, whatever it was, deserved to be heard by anyone who cared to listen. The question was, what manner of creature fights for strangers? It has never met. The chamber was so quiet that I could hear the ventilation system running. The reply, she said, came from Ambassador Kale Morrow of Earth. I will read it exactly as written in the translation that his office provided. She lifted the document. We are the children of a world that tried to kill us every day and failed. We learned that the only thing worth building is the habit of answering when someone calls for help. We do not know your gods or your songs or the names of your dead, but your sun is still burning. That was enough reason. She lowered the document. The chamber stayed quiet for a long moment. Then it did not stay quiet anymore, and the next hour was the loudest consortium's council session I had ever attended, which is saying something given that I had just sat through 7 hours of debate. I should note for the record that the 4 sentences I wrote were not entirely accurate. I said we do not know the names of your dead, and at the time I wrote it that was true, we knew nothing about the Keth, including what they called the people they had lost, but by the time Veth Erasimus read those words in the grand chamber, we had spent year learning. We knew some names, we were learning more. And the part about the only thing worth building, I meant that, but I also knew, and Ashiro knew, and anyone who had been in the planning meetings knew that the response to the Keth distress call was not entirely selfless. There were strategic interests, there were political calculations, there was the awareness that the Voratine were going to be a problem for everyone eventually, and that demonstrating capability in someone else's system was preferable to doing so in your own. Good decisions are usually made of complicated ingredients, and the test of a good decision is not whether it was simple, but whether it was right. I still believe it was right. I intend to keep believing that, partly on the evidence, and partly because 341 people paid for it, and they deserve the belief. When the session finally closed, I walked out of the grand chamber and into the corridor, and I stood there for a moment in the particular exhaustion that comes after 7 hours of sustained, careful diplomacy. Dale Price was waiting. He had been attached to my staff since the Hadal Zone, which suited me because Price was the kind of person who anticipated what you needed before you thought of it yourself. He handed me coffee, real coffee, which meant someone had gone to considerable trouble, because real coffee was not available. The Consortium Council complex. I did not ask how he had managed it. How did it go? He said. Veth Erasomos read my 4 sentences to the Grand Council. I said, I know, I watched the feed. Is there anything from Ashiro? He handed me a message on a data pad. It was very short because Ashiro's messages were always very short. It said, Analyst team confirms Vorathin approach vector. They will arrive in the outer corridor in approximately 4 months. We will be ready. Stop trying to explain us and come do the part where you make the aftermath livable. We need a diplomat more than we need a politician right now. Your call. I stood there holding the pad and the coffee, and I thought about what ready meant. It meant the fleet in the corridor and the new defense protocols and the Keth ships that had begun training alongside human vessels in the last 3 months. Slowly and awkwardly, 2 species that had never worked together before learning the language of shared force nation. It meant the consortium advisors who were now in regular communication with Earth Fleet Command instead of writing reports about Earth Fleet Command. It meant the Vorathin massing in the dark, encountering for the first time an enemy that had spent the last year not retreating but preparing. It meant in the small and practical way that most important things are small and practical before they become large. It meant that the universe had rearranged itself somewhat, and the rearrangement was not finished. I went to my office and booked a shuttle to the Vorathin corridor, leaving the next morning. Then I sat at my desk and opened my personal log and tried to write something that summed up the year. I made 5 attempts. They were all too grand, or too careful, or too much like the formal speech I had already given. I deleted all of them. What I finally wrote was this: 11 years. As a diplomat, you learn to make peace with the fact that you are not the person in the story who does the dramatic thing. You facilitate, you translate, You sit in rooms and find the language that lets different kinds of minds reach each other across the gap. It is important work. It is often invisible work, most of the time that is fine with me, but there is a moment and it comes into plumpsness the same as it comes in everything else when the language runs out, when the gap is too wide and the room is too slow and the person on the other side of the gap is saying please, and the only honest answer is to move, not to form a committee, not to draft protocol, to move. I forwarded a distress call. 4 words, that was all I did. What happened after is not mine to claim, but I keep thinking about the word that the calf used. Anyone. They did not know us. They did not know anyone. They had been alone so long that asking for help at all must have cost them something enormous, and they used that one word, the smallest possible net cast into the largest possible dark, and they waited. I grew up on a world that teaches you very early that the dark is full of things that will not wait for you to be ready. You learn to move before you feel ready, because the planet does not wait for your permission. You learn that the difference between something being survivable and something not being survivable is often just speed. We carry that with us everywhere we go. It is in how we build ships and how we plan battles and how we read a distress call at 3:00 in the morning and make a decision without a committee. It is also in how we read the names, all 341 one by one, until every one of them has been said in the air and heard by someone and recorded, because we do not allow the people we lose to become a number. Numbers are for calculations. People are for remembering. I do not know if we are good as a species. I think that is probably the wrong question. I know that we move when other things stay still. I know that we answer when other things deliberate. I know that when a world we had never heard of used the word anyone and sent it into the dark, we decided that meant us. Maybe that is enough to build on. Maybe it has to be. Tomorrow I go to the corridor and Ashiro will brief me on the Vorathines approach vector, and we will begin planning for a conflict that is 4 months away and for which we have better information than we have ever had about any enemy, because we paid attention and we kept watching even after the immediate crisis was over. The consortium will send observers. The Keth will send 2 ships. We will make it work, in somewhere on a planet that still has a functioning sun. Vether Somas will be reading whatever we send her and adding it to her understanding of what we are, and writing toward words that do not yet exist in her language. Shuttle leaves at 6. I should sleep. I looked at what I had written for a long time, then I saved it and closed the log and stood up and went to the viewport. Outside, the station hung against the dark, and around it the slow and enormous machinery of a civilization trying to figure out what to do next moved in its steady, imperfect, essential way. Delegates returning to their ships. Supply transports docking and undocking. In the far distance, just barely visible at this magnification, the blue-white point of light that was Earth's sun, 4 billion years old, still burning. I put my hand flat against the viewport glass. Then I went to bed, because the shuttle left at 6 and the universe had more work for us, and the universe did not wait. It never did, and neither did we.